Welcome to Know Better, Do Better, presented by RX Physical Therapy, where we talk to local healthcare and fitness professionals about all things injury, recovery, health, fitness, and training. Today we've got Carl Gocon on. Carl is a powerlifting coach and a strength and conditioning coach. Carl, you've got two different things going on right now, right? So you got AllCalf and Resurgence. Can you tell me a little bit about both of those?
Yeah, so my initial love was powerlifting, and that's kind of how I got myself into the coaching scene. So basically, after a couple of years of like being a powerlifter as a whole and participating in those competitions, I had a couple of my friends kind of reach out to me and want to get involved in the sport themselves. And I kind of started to do my own research and started to experiment with them with their understanding that I was new to the sport and in terms of coaching. And so that's kind of how I got like my deep dive into the coaching world for powerlifting. And it kind of was a little bit of a full circle on that front because my initial meet ever was a charity meet. And so the 5 friends that like approached me also wanted to do a charity meet. So that was kind of like a nice little full circle moment for me when they decided that, you know, they wanted me to kind of coach them and prepare them for that competition for themselves. And then from there, I kind of slowly started picking up steam and started kind of growing and getting more invested into the coaching scene, where I started doing mentorships and extracurricular like learning from that. And then in that extracurricular learning, I started realizing that, you know, I also had a like interest in the strength training field and kind of bridging the gap between strength training, rehab, and everything else like that. Because one of my initial goals in life was to kind of go to DPT school. But in terms of like certain situations and everything else like that with finances, I kind of opted for the strength training route and being able to network with great physical therapists like you and other people as well. I decided that I could kind of do a lot from this side of the playing field as well. And that's kind of how I landed where I'm at now, where AllCalf is the powerlifting section of the company that I have right now, and Resurgence delves more into the strength training and rehab-based movement styles that I kind of also like to do.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. You kind of framed it as two separate things, so like powerlifting and strength and conditioning. How do you see how do you define the difference between those two things? And like, what's the difference between AllCalf and Resurgence, between like what the goals of those things are?
So I kind of like keep them a little bit separate but together because they kind of bleed into each other in some capacities. But my vision for AllCalf powerlifting is primarily the pushing of the sport of powerlifting as a whole. So the actual competition aspect, contributing to the growth of our federations within the country and hopefully like later on like the world as well. Whereas Resurgence itself is a lot more towards the field of like strength training and rehab. So there is a little bit of a like nuance between the two there. But I definitely think that like as a powerlifter, we see a lot of different things from like a mechanical aspect when we're kind of constrained by a barbell, where that also helps us kind of see things from a strength and conditioning and rehab based aspect, where, you know, those constraints help us decide things that might be lost when people are a little bit more free moving in that kind of capacity.
Gotcha. So do you feel like there's a little bit more degrees of freedom in your programming for Resurgence versus AllCalf?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the one thing that is kind of specific about powerlifting is that you are necessary, like it's necessary for you to use a barbell in training. Like you can't not, because it's just the needs of the goal basically. Whereas Resurgence as a whole, like the way I program for people in that aspect and the people that like I work with in that lens, we can use whatever as a tool, like any machines, any like kettlebells, trap bars, other stuff like that. There is a little bit of a like carryover between that and powerlifting as a whole, because everything that we utilize is a tool for whatever goal we have. But in terms of programming for like strength-based athletes or everything else like that, your goal is always going to be the thing that you have to pay attention to. So for powerlifting athletes, their goal is to become the best that they can at the squat, bench, and deadlift. Whereas someone that like just wants to get really strong, we might just kind of utilize the trap bar and never use a barbell deadlift in that kind of like scope as a whole.
So who who is it that you're working with? So like who would fall into the AllCalf group and who would fall into the Resurgence group?
So my like general people as a whole. So obviously for anyone that's interested in the sport of powerlifting and competing, they'll kind of fall under AllCalf as a whole. That's kind of the branch that I maintain. But people that like either are in general fitness or coming from like a physical therapist or like have some sort of like weird ache or pain, but isn't like very surgery based or anything else like that. Those are the kinds of people that I've definitely worked with in person and a couple remotely on that front with Resurgence people as a whole.
That's pretty cool. So you also a powerlifting athlete as well. I saw you the other day. What were you cranking out, a 545 on your back squat or something crazy like that?
575.
Oh, my bad. I didn't want to take 30 pounds off that. That's pretty wild. So it's pretty cool that you get to do that because you see both sides of the coin, you know, so
yeah.
You're under the barbell yourself and you're coaching people with a barbell. So you can relate to what it is that they're going through, you know. Most of the people that I work with are CrossFitters or like other barbell athletes. So when they see me in a CrossFit class doing the same thing with them, you know, there's that connection, like, oh, you understand, like, you know what it is that I'm going through. So I imagine having that ability to connect with your athletes makes a pretty big difference for you.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a huge thing that gets lost, especially in like rehab based things, especially when you have people kind of go to a non-specific practitioner as a whole. And someone that doesn't get it, because then you have some people that will go to a like in-network clinic where like the physical therapist sees 3 or 4 different people, but then because they don't always understand the needs of the individual, things get lost in translation. Like if a barbell athlete were to go to like an in-network clinic where they're possibly doing like 3x10 on clamshells and stuff like that,
might not even have a barbell.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things, even as it pertains to kind of like powerlifting athletes, where like I feel as a coach and as like a trainer as a whole, if you can't understand where the people that you're like talking to are coming from, that makes you less relatable and less able to understand how to kind of help them. Like for me as like an athlete, I go through aches and pains like as on my own. So being able to kind of talk people through that issues and those kind of like time frames helps a lot, where some people like have to deal with like chronic shoulder pains or things like that they've like gone through just because of their history, and being able to kind of understand that and kind of the sensations and the frustrations that we go through as athletes who care about what we do is always going to be an important factor to be an effective coach and trainer, and honestly just an effective person when we connect with others.
So I like you said a lot of things that I really like to hear. Talking about like developing people first and then athletes second, I think is huge, you know. I mean, there's not much more to say, right? Like when we develop good people, give them good like mental fortitude, mental skills, that's going to carry over into so many other parts of their life. But for you, giving them that mental fortitude is also going to carry over to the platform, right? Which I imagine helps their lifts and their outcomes and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially like when things don't always go at like according to plan. Like that's one of the primary things that we like go through a lot as like we look at the overarching picture. We spend like 12 weeks at a time for like 9 chances at a like lift basically. And over the course of those like 12 weeks, we're doing like hundreds of like attempts where like, you know, at the end of it all, we have these 9 that mean the most to us. And when one of those goes wrong, how do we kind of continue on? Especially like if the like thing that goes wrong is early on in the day. Like I've had people like start their competition days off with a miss for whatever like reason, whether it's by standards or like some like misgroove or anything else like that. How do you come back from that? And that's kind of making sure that they as people have the tools to kind of like bounce back and have the tools, and understanding that, like, a miss doesn't have to define you. But that kind of difference also comes into play when we consider people that like deal with like those injuries, or like a small instance in like the gym or training where like, okay, like their like back is tweaked or their shoulder kind of like hurts, but overarching, like from an overarching perspective, that doesn't have to be the end of your world, especially like in that time frame when you have the tools and the references available.
So what are some of the tools that you have, or like how do you help people get through some of that stuff? Somebody goes up and they miss their first lift, like that's a huge confidence killer. Like what do you say to them in between to help them get their confidence back?
I think there is a couple of different like factors when it comes into that, especially based off of what the miss was based off of. Some people like might miss it off a technicality. So like in a powerlifting competition, obviously one of the big things for like squat, which is the first discipline that we go through, is a depth call. So like people like that, depending on how we've been training and everything else like that, my goal for a lot of my powerlifters is to make sure that like we're always training to standard and not kind of letting ourselves get away with half-assed attempts. But when it comes down to that, we have certain like small adjustments that we can kind of rely on in the meet, where like, if they get a missed call on depth, maybe we can adjust their squat stance a little bit, like for the purposes of making sure that it becomes unquestionable on that front. I've had people that's happened with before where, their squat stance is a little bit narrow, so they run out of room in their hips to kind of get into that. Sorry, I don't know if you could hear the motorcycle, but when it comes down to like their squat pattern is a little bit more narrow because that's where they feel strongest. But in terms of competition depth, sometimes it's not there, or sometimes the judge from their perspective angle is a little bit more aggressive on that call. So we can kind of widen their squat stance and give them the room to kind of sink it while also being able to mechanically deal with whatever they need to and kind of get the lift as a whole. So those are like some of the small adjustments that I've been able to do. For other people, sometimes it's kind of just talking them through their head game and their self-talk, because some of them are like, oh, like what if I don't hit depth, or what if I can't hit depth? And when you go into a lift already telling yourself that, you're already in a weird kind of coming from behind position at the end of the day with that. So that's like one of the things that like I try to kind of make sure that all of my athletes can kind of take away from where they're coming from, because that's the same thing with the like even recovering from like, again, an injury or anything else like that. Your self-talk and kind of the way you perceive it is super important for like certain outcomes that we deal with at the end of the day too with that.
Makes sense. Yeah, you gotta address the problem that they have. No one size fits all answer.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm sure that there's a ton of, or I know there's a ton of powerlifting coaches and strength and conditioning coaches in the area around here, northern New Jersey. So what is something that you think is unique about what you do, or how you do it, or how you like what your philosophy on training or movement is, or how you interact with your athletes?
I think in terms of like being unique, everyone tries very hard to like stand out at the end of the day and try and kind of like do something different. But I think that I think what I do that kind of sets me apart is being me well, like, because at the end of the day, as individuals, like we are individual, and making sure that like the people that I connect with me and resonate with me as a coach and athlete, and being able to build that makes what like the community that I've been working to build super sustainable at the end of the day, because a lot of them resonate with me, and then that can kind of mean that they resonate with each other pretty decently as well, and making sure that being able to build that as a whole helps everyone grow at the end of the day with that, because I've seen coaches try and like introduce some like radical thing with, I mean, before we had a lot of people kind of like introduce PRI, and that made everyone different. You had a bunch of people start using the FMS in powerlifting, and that made people different, and everything else like that, FRC, so on and so forth, any acronym that you can think of.
All the alphabet soups.
Yeah, exactly. And like, don't get me wrong, like I pull from all of those different thoughts and different tools and everything else like that. But like, when you're trying to utilize those things to be like the set apart when we all have access to those tools, we just need to know that we can kind of utilize them well in the situations that we have at the end of the day with that. I like feel like that's always a cop-out answer, because it's always like one of those things where it's like, we as coaches and people are like unique, and that's where we're coming from. But I think that really resonates with the way I kind of approach coaching and everything else like that, because my goal is to always be the best coach that I can be and the best coach for the people that I serve at the end of the day.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I first met you and I was looking into some of your stuff, there were two things that really drew me to you. One of which was you took some of the ideas from like the functional movement camp, call that what it is, or label those whoever they are, we'll just call it like multi-directional or multi-planar movement that you see in more field or court athletes and their training. I think you took some of those things and integrated them into powerlifting training. And then the other thing was you put a pretty strong emphasis on like mentality and emotion and, that the psychological side of things, and layered that on top of what you do and who you do it with. So I thought that was like really, really interesting.
Yeah, because I think one of like the best words as it pertains to kind of like us as coaches and us as trainers is like the holistic approach, making sure that we as like individuals and people are serviced first, because at the end of the day, a lot of people kind of connect their identities to what they're like going through at the like with that. Like a lot of people identify as a power lifter, or people like identify as a person with an injury, so on and so forth. But like making sure that we're addressing the mindset behind it, understanding that like those things, while good for us, don't have to be the sole thing that define us, like with all of that.
Yeah, I love that. I just love that you were able to kind of separate those things out and layer them one on top of the other. And I have to imagine that, like we were talking about before, some mental fortitude, those things have to really do well for your athletes and help them compete and train.
Yeah, I definitely think that's like one of the things that I like really try and hit home on like as consistently as I can as a coach and as a like trainer.
Yeah. So if you had to like define who the people are that you work with, like who is it that you like to work with as a coach?
I think that like for me, I've actually defined this pretty decently when it comes down to like the core values that I see in the people that I like to work with as a whole, and kind of like boiling down to people that like stay true to themselves, are super authentic. So like being honest with yourself. And as a powerlifting coach, being honest with yourself is super important in training, because, when it comes down to the standards of lifting, the kind of exertions that you have to be staying between and everything else like that, that definitely like hits home for a lot of people like that within powerlifting. And in terms of like the people that I like work with in person and everything like that, because, you have to be able to be comfortable with people that are meant to help you, so like if you have to feel like you're wearing a mask with them, in terms of like who you are, that's not ever going to line up for a good like fit, or that's not going to line up for a decent end result. And making sure that they're willing to kind of grow within the culture and community that I've built as a whole, to making sure that they're open-minded in those aspects and open-minded to new ideas. Because like you said, my approach isn't like strictly like mechanical based and everything else like that. They have to be open-minded to hearing like how their mindset impacts their training, how their like approach and perspective also makes a difference. And obviously when we do some like interesting like movement based drills or anything else like that, while they might seem a little bit odd to like the people that don't understand it, there's a reason for everything. So making sure that they're open-minded to a lot of those things. And this one itself kind of has been resonating a lot more recently for me, is someone that like takes ownership of their actions. Like you and I are here to be good guides for them, but like you can't force someone to like do the work. You can't force someone to like make sure they're doing their homework when it comes to like rehab exercises, or doing like staying true to the like their RPEs that we give them as coaches.
Doing their accessory work or mobility work.
Exactly. Like those are the people that I know that I resonate well with, as long as like if they can own that. Like the aforementioned ones, like there's a little bit of give, but if you can't own your actions, I can't work with you. That's like the the baseline thing at the end of the day with that.
Yeah, I respect that. You gotta be able to connect with the people and jive with the people that you're working with. This way it can be a good environment for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So like powerlifting has the stigma of just a whole bunch of meatheads, right? So
Yeah.
I know that that's not the case and not the truth. But what do you wish people knew about powerlifting, strength and conditioning, or like the coaching world for you?
I think, you know, one thing that I will say is that there is a little bit a movement away from like the meathead mentality or like kind of just, you know, grinding through everything. Like there is a lot more movement toward like the science-based and evidence-based like practice and learning a lot more about it, where a lot of people are kind of going into the data side of like powerlifting and realizing that like these trends can be tracked and like you can try your best to kind of understand that. But I definitely think that I wish more people understood that training and everything is a tool for us. And one of the biggest things that I think gets overlooked is that like all exercises are made up, you know, at the end of the day. Like we literally put a constraint on something and tell you to do something with it. And at the end of the day, that's just working us towards a goal. You have a lot of people that kind of adjust certain like exercises and everything. And then I've seen people argue over nuance that's super like unnecessary. Like if you can kind of put a foam roller on someone and get them to perform an action based off what we're looking for, why knock it, you know? And I think that that's something that I wish was a little bit more widespread amongst like general fitness people as well, where like they get super like territorial over certain movements, territorial over certain exercises and everything else like that, where, you know, you can modify anything based off of like morphology, like anatomy, constraints, whatever you have to create the intended goal, you know? And I wish that was something that was a lot more utilized, I think, more commonly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dynamic systems theory in a nutshell. You and I have kind of spoken about that a few times. You know, we're just trying to create a specific movement outcome. So if we can change the environment, change like the sensory input to people, like we can get that outcome. It doesn't really matter what tool or strategy you use, as long as you can get there. That's really all that matters.
Yeah, agreed. That's like the big nutshell that definitely gets overlooked, I think.
Yeah. So last question I'm going to ask you is, what is your favorite thing about powerlifting, whether it's as an athlete or as a coach?
I think as a coach from like a powerlifting perspective, seeing people go from the start to where they are now, and obviously that kind of applies to just any coaching movement and kind of every like on that front. I've seen people start from like not being able to bench the barbell to being able to bench like 135, so on and so forth. Like that, those are the like little big things that like mean the world to me, because you know those are the people that stick with it and take their time and do their due diligence and succeed at it. And from an athlete perspective, I think I just enjoy moving like big ass weight. Like, you know, I think as a person who like loves squatting, one of like my favorite things, and kind of having that happen recently with like my most recent PR attempt, is being able to have the, again, mental fortitude to get through slow reps, but make sure that they're efficient and done properly and done effectively at the end of the day, and succeed at them. That's like one of like my favorite like parts of being an athlete and being a decent squatter at the end of the day. So
I don't know, man, 575, that's a little better than decent. You're not a huge guy, and that's a whole lot of weight. That's a whole lot of weight.
Yeah, that was actually like my first 3 times body weight squat, which was like a benchmark that I'd been like looking forward to for a long ass time. Mm-hmm. So being able to like check that off, and obviously a lot of those things are a little bit arbitrary, but like, you know, that's like a pretty nice benchmark to say that you've squatted 3 times your own body weight. Like, and so I was pretty souped about that as a whole. So
yeah, I think you deserve to, man. Well, thank you for coming on and chatting with me. For anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about AllCalf or Resurgence, or you know how they can get in touch with you or work with you, where can people find you?
So you can reach out to me on my personal lifting/coaching Instagram at allcalf.gocon. So at ALL calf.gocon. And then our business page is at resurgence.movement on Instagram. Both of those are on Instagram. And you can also kind of see more about what we are doing with the company as a whole on our website, resurgence-movement.com. And from there, you can either reach out to us on our contact forms, or you can DM us or email us from there.
Awesome. So for anybody who's listening to this and they want to learn a little bit more, go hit up Carl, check out some of his Instagram stuff. There's some pretty cool things on there, like we had talked about. And Carl, thank you again for stopping by. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. I'm happy to be here.
All right. Take care.